This room has got some issues that I'm not 100% sure how to navigate just yet. But I'll figure it out little by little. All right. Yes. Hopefully this is working, I hope. So, this era in American history, America's Gilded Age, 1870 to 1890. The good thing about the Foner textbook is that it has nice, clear time divisions. So you'll know, okay, for this period I got to know this, for that period I got to know that. So for the America's Gilded Age, it is characterized by a variety of things. The first thing is what I mentioned, a tremendous increase in wealth because of the Second Industrial Revolution. The first Industrial Revolution took place in the early 1800s. The first movement of peoples to cities to work in factories. The Second Industrial Revolution took place in this period because of the end of the Civil War. There's no more division between North and South. There's a transcontinental railroad that unifies the whole country. Resources are going into investment in new cities, new factories. There's no more money diverted. There's no more fighting over an issue of slavery. And America changes as a consequence. Factories, mines, railroads continue to expand hand over fist throughout the country. This is a period where you start to see for the first time that balance tilt, where the majority of the people once lived in the countryside, now they're flooding into the cities. America is slowly becoming more and more urban. People are moving in from the cities, from south to north, from overseas to here, from Europe especially. The factory is now the primary place of production. The idea that most things can be made at home by a small craftsman is disappearing. The old ways are done. Now, the only thing you're making at home is your dinner. But clothing, your shoes, what's that? Well, New York City is a unique experience where you can get your fully roasted chicken on any corner. Well, in my neighborhood of Washington Heights. And the Upper East Side. Roasted chicken, it's everywhere in this city. Now, you also see the growth of big cities. What we know today of as New York City, Chicago, Detroit, it's happening now because the people are flooding in for the work in the big cities. And the immigrants, which we'll get to in a future chapter. Now, part of the reason for all this, besides the end of the war that I just mentioned, the Civil War, is simply that technological innovations made communication between east and west of the country, north and south, and America and overseas easier. Between 66 and 82, that should be typewrite, there's an R in there. Between 66 and 82, these inventions drastically increased communication. And if you want to increase trade, you have to increase communication. With transcontinental cable, you could now instantaneously communicate with any part of the world. Before, you'd have to send your message on a boat. It would take weeks. Now, if New York merchants want to know what the going price is for, British rifles, the answer is immediate. And New York merchants communicate with their customers in Chicago, who communicate with their customers in Wisconsin, whatever. It's instantaneous communication. Same thing with the telephone, the typewriter, camera, and all economic expansion demands cheap energy. The first power plant in Manhattan goes up in 1882. Communication, cheap energy, expanding population, which is your customer base. It's got all the makings for economic expansion. Somebody's getting rich. But only a small group of people are getting rich. Now, what happens because of this huge economic expansion? Well, when you have all this increased production, what happens when you have more stuff on the market than people are comfortable buying? What happens? All right, let me take it back. When factories overproduce something, and the customers just aren't interested in buying it because they can go anywhere, what do you do to make sure those customers buy your product, what would you do? You lower the prices. But if you lower your prices, what happens to your profits? They shrink. And since you're in massive competition with all these other people, everyone's competing to lower prices. Now you might say, what's wrong with lowering prices? Well, because the people lowering prices eventually got to lay off their workers, right? Then they can't afford anything because they got no money. What happens because of this increasing drop in prices, people are going out of business. They can't keep up. There was that first initial overproduction. It triggers the Great Depression of 1873 to 97. All right? Now, the Great Depression that most of you all have heard about is the one that happens in the 1929 to the 1930s. That's the Great Depression. And we'll get to that. But this one was, in many ways, even just as consequential. Because in this period, America really changed into this Gilded Age problem where money got concentrated to a small group of people. What happened? In this period, where it became harder and harder to make a profit, the smaller businesses, the medium-sized factories, they couldn't keep up as they reduced their prices. And what happened? They got bought out. They got bought out by their much wealthier competitors. All right? Two people emerge at this time. Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. Now, both of these we now know, what the hell's it called? Carnegie Hall. And John D. Rockefeller, well, he's just given money, his family has given money everywhere. This was a way for these tycoons to improve their image after their very bad reputation from this period. Now, Carnegie controlled the steel industry through vertical integration. In the midst of everybody having trouble, he controlled the whole steel industry from the mines, through the processing, through the distribution. He just bought everybody from the bottom up. So this one guy controlled the price of steel in America at a time when railroad construction and building construction that demanded steel, the demand was going up. Rockefeller, again, oil, pretty important during a time of industrial expansion. He horizontally integrated, meaning he just bought up all the oil fields and refineries at the bottom level. And then he started buying the next level in terms of processing and distribution. So you got one guy who controlled steel and one guy who controlled oil at a time when America was expanding exponentially. What's wrong with that? Both of these guys had a lot of workers in their employ, and neither one of these guys were all that interested in catering to the workers' economic interests. Why? Because it's survival of the fittest. You compete, you buy out your competitors, you get rich, you wipe out your enemy. You do whatever it takes. And how do you do that? Well, one of the things you do is you keep your labor costs as low as possible. These guys were intolerant of any sort of labor organization, and workers simply had a crappy life. And these two guys employed hundreds of thousands, millions of workers, but they were representative of the view of labor at the time, which is you work and you shut up. If you don't like it, go somewhere else, but don't stay and complain. So what was a worker's life like at this time during the Second Industrial Revolution? Economic insecurity. You never knew if you were going to get hired, fired, a raise, pay cut. You didn't know. Unreliability of employment. Were you hired for 6 months, a year? Doesn't matter. Your employer calls all the shots because you have no other choice. You're just happy for the job. Lack of pensions. What happens when you're old and you can't work anymore? Well, then you retire and you basically die of hunger and poverty. Everyone's heard of Social Security, right? All right, well, you know, before Social Security, most seniors died in poverty in this country. Most seniors died in poverty in this country. Because not every senior had a family that could take care of them until they died. Social Security eliminated elderly poverty in this country. Back then, if you were a worker and you couldn't work anymore, Well, you basically died in poverty, and quick, too. What else? Lack of compensation for injury. You got hurt on the job. What happens? Well, when you get fired, we get someone else. What if you're pregnant? Well, that's too bad for you. We'll get someone who's not pregnant. It's that simple. You worked 12 and more hour days, 60 days a week. Your workplace was dangerous. It was too hot in the summer, cold in the winter. You complained? There's always somebody else outside who'll take your job and not complain. And it wasn't just the workers' conditions that made it clear that America was changing during the Great Depression, that there was an increasing class divide. There was also the fact that you now had, for the first time, obvious working class ghettos. You know Lower East Side, the tenement? Anybody been down to the Tenement Museum in the Lower East Side? All right. The Lower East Side of this city used to be just, we don't have anything left in the city that's that congested, with people living on top of each other, multiple families in the same apartment. We don't have that anymore. But for the first time, New York had a visible working class poor neighborhood. And for the first time, the middle and upper classes were living elsewhere, further uptown in Manhattan or away from the downtown and getting into town through trams, basically the pre-subway, the above-ground subway. You had actual geographical segregation because of the increasing divide between rich and poor. And this number startles me. The richest 1% of America had more property than the bottom 50%. Does that number make sense? If you take the richest 1% of Americans at that time, let's say that would be 100, right? And then you took 50% of the poorest Americans, and that would be, I don't know, let's say 200 million. That 100 up top had more money than the 200 million at the bottom combined. So that income discrepancy was pronounced. So that's part one, the second industrial revolution, increasing income discrepancy. The second thing that happened is a transformation of the West. The West in America had always been a place of promise. We're giving out land for free out West. You can go out there and make your own living, because the government, once it settles that land, it's giving it away cheaply to settlers, because they want white settlement out West to develop that land. Well, who was there first? Who was there first? Native Americans. They're on the land, they're in the way, they get pushed off. During this period, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, white settlement out West increases. So there's greater contact with Native Americans, and there's greater tensions, because whites want to build railroads, they want to dig the mines, they want to build cities, and Native Americans just want to be left alone.
But they were in the West in the first place because the whites threw them there.
There were those that were transported west, but there were already Native Americans out west that had minimal contact. Now, even they got in trouble, right? Like, did you ever think about some of the names? Manhattan, Amsterdam. Well, Amsterdam, that's because of the Dutch who settled here. But Manhattan is based on an old Native American name. These other names, like Syosset, or yeah, like these are all Native American names. So all of this, the original 13 colonies, well, they existed because many of the Native Americans were wiped out and pushed west. But now, there's more and more whites pushing even further west into the plain states, like the flat state, like Nebraska, and so on and so on. So, they push out there and they displace, they put many of these Native Americans into reservations, amongst other things. But also the West gets corporatized, and I'll explain that right now. The same thing that was happening in industry was happening in farming. During the Great Depression, there was a lot of overproduction, so prices went down. Farmers were losing money as prices went down, so they got bought out by corporations. bought up all these little farms. They brought them together because the only way to make a profit is through economies of scale. Has anybody ever heard of this term? Maybe took an economics class here in Hutchtos or elsewhere? All right. Economies of scale is easy. You can make a profit, but only after you invest heavily in the most modern technology. That's what economies of scale means, right? If you invest in the most modern technology, the most modern seed or whatever, in the case of farming, you will make a profit in the long run, because this stuff will produce more for you in the long run. You follow me so far? But the only person who can afford that level of investment, because it's so huge, are the wealthy. So the small farmer, he could survive if he had the money to buy the most advanced technology and to use it on a large plot of land. But he doesn't have that money. If he did, he wouldn't be a small farmer, he'd be a large farmer. So these small farmers are losing money, they're selling to whoever's coming. So corporations coming in, they buy all the small corn farms, they group them together, and they hire inexpensive migrant laborers. Laborers are just traveling the countryside looking for work. White, Mexican, Native American, doesn't matter. Then they start buying up mines, consolidating that. They start buying up forests, consolidating that. So all of a sudden, the idea of the small farmer or the guy that owns a small lumber yard or has a mine or two, this disappears. It's all being bought up by corporations during the Great Depression. And they hire migrant laborers, just like the workers with Carnegie and Rockefeller, and they get paid poorly. So the working conditions of the workers out west are just as bad as the working conditions of the workers in the cities, in the big cities and out east. Now, the other thing that happened, as more and more whites went west, there was greater contact with Native Americans, greater tensions, and the federal government became much more involved in eliminating this barrier. So, of course, violence was the result. These Native Americans, the more and more they saw this onslaught of endless whites, they pushed back. And once white settlers are attacked by Native Americans, then the army comes in and they wipe out towns, villages. But then you have hunters that wipe out the buffalo, which is what many of these plains as in the plains out west, the plains tribes of Indians survived on. So you've got the army, you've got the hunters, endless white settlement. Eventually, those that survive are placed on reservations where the economics are just miserable. And it's a cycle of poverty, which continues today. Unless you happen to get lucky and you build a casino on your land. Now then, the other way that Native Americans, those that survived the imposition, the expansion of the whites to the west, they had their culture come under attack. Right from the very beginning, this country had no idea what to do with Native Americans. They had no idea what to do with them. They tried, they couldn't enslave them because they would just escape, because they knew the land better than everyone else. Yeah. The reservations, they had no choice. They had nowhere else to go. Nowhere to work, nowhere to hunt. And being on their own, they would just be easy targets. From the very beginning, white settlers in this country had no idea what to do with Native Americans. At first, they accepted their help, and thus was born the Thanksgiving feast that we still celebrate. This was the cooperation between the early English settlers in what today is Massachusetts and the first Indians that they had contact. Without the Native Americans, the white settlers would not have survived the first winter here, because the white settlers didn't know where to get food, what to eat, how to survive. But over time, more and more whites came. Wars broke out because of land encroachment, and obviously the whites won. Plus, we brought chicken pox and wiped out millions of people, and measles and mumps. Now, Thomas Jefferson, our third president, he had this notion that eventually one could, and I love this part about American history, how certain groups of people can eventually become Americans, but certain groups of people can never become Americans. So Native Americans, it was believed by Thomas Jefferson, and it wasn't, he was rare in his opinion, but he said, you know what, we teach them English, we teach them Western culture, you know, we get them to stop moving around and build homes and just have regular jobs. They're really indistinguishable from us. We can teach them to be like Western Europeans and Americans. Not everybody agree with that. A lot of people just said they were savages and you can't teach them anything. In this period, that kind of thinking of, well, we're either going to wipe them all out or we'll just make them more like us, because otherwise we can't live together, was turned into law. And thus was born the Dawes Act, the third thing on the list there. The Dawes Act was a systematic attempt to, in addition to all the things on this list, whatever Indian lands still existed were broken up and distributed to whites so that they didn't have an independent land and power base. Indians were forced to accept white culture. What else? Let's see. Citizenship was denied only if you accepted all the provisions of the Dawes Act, which essentially meant you had to completely give up Native American culture to have American citizenship. And you might say, well, why would you want American citizenship? Well, to have the vote, so that you can actually control your future. What else? Well, the freedom for Americans to subjugate, not so much for Native Americans. Where was it? All right, I forgot what I wanted to say. The climax of this imposition of white culture onto a dwindling Native American culture is the Wounded Knee, the Battle of Wounded Knee, and the massacre at Wounded Knee, which is in South Dakota, which took place in December 1890. Here's a photo of the dead being buried pile upon pile by the U.S. military. This was the U.S. Army massacring 200 Native Americans, mostly women and children. The belief was that what was being organized was an uprising against white settlers. In fact, it turned out it was a cultural festival. And so the Army went in all paranoid because of the increasing tension between Native Americans and whites, and wiped out the Native Americans at Wounded Knee, which remains in the memory of Native Americans to this day. Let's talk politics. What else is going on in America besides the corporatization of the West, increasing income divisions? Politics. What's generally recognized for politics in this era is that it was about as corrupt as it has ever been. Why? Because when you take that much money, which the corporations have, and there is no limit to how much money can be given to politicians at this time, well, people are saying we are living through a second Gilded Age today. So now you know when they say that, what the hell they're talking about. So, the politics were a mess. There was unbelievable wealth, unbelievable corruption, and corporations, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the big mines, the big forestry industries, how did they get what they wanted? They bought political protection. And the politicians were happy to take it. And in case you missed it, we had our own most recent example of scandal, political scandal, just a couple of weeks ago, when the Speaker of the New York Assembly, Sheldon Silver, who has held that position for over 20 years, had to resign because he was arrested by the federal government for essentially taking money for not doing any jobs that he said he was doing. Albany, just like a perfect example of political corruption. But what was the case of politics? With all this money flowing into the political coffers of politicians, nothing was getting done. First of all, the country was evenly divided. The Democrats controlled the House of Representatives, the Republicans controlled the Senate, and they hated each other. So they couldn't actually figure out any legislation that they could agree on, which is problematic because at this time you needed legislation for the increasing number of poor, the economic problems America was fighting or suffering through. So that's A. The parties couldn't agree, and they couldn't get anything done. B, the politicians were so incredibly corrupt that even if they could agree, they had no interest in dealing with the interests of the poor. The Republicans, where are they? Let me give you the specifics. The Republicans were in the pocket of big industry, the factories. These guys favored high tariffs, meaning they wanted to make it difficult for foreign companies to sell their products in America, right? Because they were in the pockets of big industry, they supported industrialists who didn't want to support any working class rights, okay? The Democrats were no better. The Democrats were close to the banking industry. And the banks made it incredibly difficult to get loans for small businesses because of their particular monetary policy. All you need to know is both the Republicans and the Democrats were in the pocket of big business, big banks, big industry. And the poor were being ignored. Here, I wanted to give you an idea of how both parties were evenly divided. The Republicans were strong in the industrial north and the Midwest, Chicago, Detroit, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana. The agrarian West, Colorado, Utah, etc. Evangelical Protestants, Protestant immigrants, which were fewer and fewer at that time, and blacks. Republicans, the party of Abraham Lincoln, the party that abolished slavery. Even when the Republican Party became increasingly conservative in the late 19th century and the early 20th century and favored the rich over the poor and did not say a word about race relations ever again, African American voters who could still vote in the North continued to vote Republican. You know when they started voting Democrat? During the 1930s, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt started passing policies that favored the poor, regardless of race. Roosevelt did nothing for blacks in the country, but he helped the poor. Democrats were strong in the South. They were strong with the immigrants, the Catholic voters, and the big cities. Right? Most of this is still true today, except for the regions. Democrats are stronger in the North, Republicans are stronger in the South now. And we'll get to this why in the future. And now, African American voters are now overwhelmingly supporting Democrats. There are virtually no, the Republican Party has got virtually no African American or Latino voters, much less members of their party. And Asian Americans and Muslim Americans. Like, they're just not going to the Republican Party. The Republican Party is about as white as you can be in this country. Right? Yes. Now, the reason this changes is the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s pushed. Anybody see the movie Selma? Anybody? See the movie Selma. Regardless of the Academy Award scandal, it's a good movie. Now, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were signed into law by a Democratic Southern president, Lyndon Johnson. At that point, Southern whites abandoned the Democratic Party and went to the Republican Party. And that's when black voters started registering and joining the Democratic Party by the millions, which is the case today, North and South. Now, I already talked about this. All right. During all this time, there was increasing discussion. Okay, As people were looking around and seeing this permanent poverty, that families were poor generation after generation, no matter how hard they worked, the dream, the American dream of if you just work hard, you will escape poverty, people were starting to realize this is no longer happening. People came to this country to free religious persecution, blah, 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 blah. But many of them came for land, for opportunity. And the belief was the travel over from Europe to the New World was crappy. And when you first land, it's hard and it's crappy. But there's always land to farm, there's always work in the cities, so if you can get through those first few years, you will eventually achieve stability and eventually have your own shop or your own farm, whatever. By the end of the 19th century, this dream of you come, you suffer, you work, and then you're golden, more and more people didn't believe it because there was generations of poverty. No matter how hard people worked, they were just stuck in these low-paying, unskilled jobs. So the question came up, are these people free?
Still no.
Well, here's the thing. Freedom is an interesting term.
You have limited freedom.
Well, it depends on how you define freedom. Like Sumner would say freedom is get the government out of my pocket, don't tax me, don't tell me who to hire, who to fire, I work, leave me alone. But for the working class, they are robbed of economic independence. They're always working for somebody else, right? Crappy wages, long hours. And for them, they say, yes, I am equal to the rich guy. If we both commit a murder and are convicted, we both are going to get what the books say is the penalty for murder. Yes, he has a better lawyer, but the books say you commit murder, everybody gets the same punishment. That's our 14th Amendment, equal rights to all citizens born in this country. But, well, in theory, in practice, everything's a mess. But in theory, all citizens are those born here and are equal in the face of the law. That's got nothing to do with racial profiling. It's got nothing to do with police brutality. I'm talking about in theory, right? And remember, the theory is kind of important, because the theory is the shit that you get to sue on and take people to court. There is no theory, there is no law, then you're just screwed. The goal is to enforce the law and to, actually listen to it. Now, for the poor, for them, freedom and equality couldn't just be equality in the face of the law. It had to be more. Because for a poor person to say, I have my freedom of speech, my First Amendment rights, I'm happy. Well, obviously that's crap. Because what does your First Amendment right mean if you're starving? Right? What is the right to bear arms? What does it matter if you're hungry, if your kids are starving? So then it becomes a matter of what is real freedom? Well, real freedom is not starving. Well, how do we get there? Because I'm working, but I'm not getting anything for it. So, and I'm a citizen, the 14th Amendment says I'm a citizen. I'm working hard, I'm not a criminal or anything, so why am I suffering? Who's supposed to help me out of this situation? The government. My government. Government I voted for. Government my taxes keep in business. They're my government. They're not doing me a favor, they work for me. So Graham Sumner's people would say, the government needs to stay out of the economy as much as possible. Don't interfere with the liberty, the freedom of the business person. The poor and the working class say, what do you mean you're staying out of my business? My suffering is your business. I'm a citizen like Rockefeller. You have my taxes. What are you doing for me? Freedom is not just my 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all that stuff. That's wonderful. I love it. Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, Eighth Amendment right against cruel and unusual punishment. That's wonderful. But what does it matter if I'm starving? And what are you going to do for me? Don't tell me government shouldn't be involved in the American economy. The American economy is an American American people's issue. So deal with it. So the result of that, we've already done this, social Darwinism, the people that say if you're poor, that's your problem. Liberty of contract. I love liberty of contract. Liberty of contract is, you're a worker. You came to me for a job. You knew what the job was going to be like when you got here. You can't take the job, then all of a sudden say, yeah, I want more money. You knew how much you were going to get paid when I hired you. I don't want to work this many hours. You knew how many hours you're going to work when you got the job. You freely enter a contract, liberty of contract, and you are free to get out if you don't like it. You can't stay and complain. And you certainly can't organize your friends and gang up against me. I hired you, and I'll fire you. And you're free to take this job or any other job. Right? That's liberty of contract. And it's defended, and the courts were all over this stuff. Any type of regulation of the workplace, the courts at the time believed like Sumner did. Government has no right to interfere in the economic workplace. End of story. What did I miss? Good. All right. The result of all this paralyzed politics, refusal to help the poor, led to an explosion of labor organizing. Because if there's one thing that's been consistent throughout history, it's been this. You put enough people that are suffering in the same geographic place, they're going to start talking to each other. And they're going to say, this sucks. We all have the same thing in common. What are we going to do about it? Well, there's more of us than there are of them. Why don't we organize? It doesn't have to be violent. But if we organize all the workers and we just don't work, maybe they'll listen. So this is what happened. The first great railroad strike, labor strike of the time, took place in 1877. Railroad workers, remember, this was a period of massive expansion of industry, railroads, trade. So the railroad workers had it pretty bad. Railroad workers went on strike because there was a cut in their pay. The entire country was paralyzed because if the railroads aren't working, how do you have trade? The government freaked out. They called out the militias, the National Guard. Workers were beaten up. Strikes were broken. Dozens were killed in the process. The result of this organized violence against workers led to an explosion of labor organizing. Because the realization was the American dream is rapidly coming to an end. We work our asses off, but the moment we try to organize for better pay, they send out the military and they kill us. The result is we have to get organized. The first group that successfully tapped into this frustration of the working class, the first great union, was the Knights of Labor. A nice sounding name. The Knights, like the Middle Ages. The Knights of Labor, fighting for a glorious cause. These guys managed to bring together 800,000 workers by 1886. This was a huge deal. Now, I don't want to make these guys out to be really good. They organized, they were racist. They wouldn't organize Asians. Okay? So, but they did organize men and women, blacks and whites. But somehow Asians was too far for them. That was the line for them. Go ahead. Somebody had a question. To organize on a massive scale, workers. Now, these guys, their goal was to fight against the prevailing thinking of the time, which was liberty of contract, which is don't interfere with the economic system. Workers freely come and go. Their argument was, that's crap. If all the jobs suck, if all the employers suck, you can't just go to the next better job. They all pay poorly. They're all unsafe. They're all unstable. There is no freedom. So let's organize and make it all better. Their biggest concern is the loss of economic independence. Because if you no longer control your own finances, if you're always poor, you don't have any real independence. You can be bullied into anything. In 1886, the Knights of Labor were at the biggest they were ever going to get. This was a time, their biggest success was the achievement of the 8-hour workday. We take for granted today that if you go to work, you work 8 hours. If you don't, if you go over, legally you have to get time and a half, overtime. This is the result of the Knights of Labor who organized workers in the late 19th century and successfully went on strike and forced the government to recognize you couldn't exploit workers uncontrollably. But there was a consequence. The increasing organization of workers, the attack on free market capitalism, freaked out the rich, it freaked out their political allies, and the politicians are the ones who control the military and the guns and the police. And as we all know, and as we have recently been made quite aware on television, doesn't matter how many people you get on the streets, it's the ones with the guns that tend to make the most consequential decisions, right? So, there was a massive strike in Chicago in 85, in 86, iron molder strikes. The May 3rd, 1886 strike led to killings, police on the strikers. On May 4th, the day after, there was a rally to protest the killings. And just like many of the rallies that we've had in New York City recently, when you get that many people together, you got those that are peaceful and just want to march, and then you got a few wackos in there who just want to set shit on fire. At the time, Haymarket Square in Chicago, there was a number of people there that were not interested in peaceful demonstration. Bombs were thrown, exploded, policemen were injured, the police overreacted, marched in, and there's a whole lot of killing. This further example of the use of force against labor organizers, and they followed up by arresting labor leaders, by raiding their offices, trying to destroy the union in Chicago. This kind of overreaction convinced workers that they had to keep going. The only way to stop exploitation is through organization. Am I done? Hang on. I'll let you out. Relax a bit. Relax. Here's the Haymarket affair. This was the violence of the Haymarket attack the police on the rioters. So, that's the Gilded Age. Poverty, subjugation of Native Americans, exploitation of the poor, political paralysis, labor organization. Let's see what's next. Farmers who get pissed off and fight back. That's Thursday, the populist platform. See you then. Especially the volunteers, don't forget who you are.